in the majority of the tribes that we researched, their belief was that someone who was of a different sexuality or gender possessed the male and female spirit and sort of walked in perfect balance.
Mm.
And so the term two-spirit fit.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to make a contribution, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. Now join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a cis queer woman and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with Beverly Little Thunder, an activist, community leader and teacher, and founder of a non-profit organisation that provides a safe space for ceremony for Indigenous LGBTQIA people. Beverly uses she and her pronouns, and she is a Two-Spirit Lakota woman from the Standing Rock Band in North Dakota. Find out more about her story in this episode. We also talk about what the term Two-Spirit encompasses, how religious indoctrination led to Two-Spirit people being ostracised, the cultural and societal roles we assign masculinity and femininity to, how tradition has evolved with community needs, that you don't have to give birth to be a role model, and the importance of telling your own story. To clarify some terminology that is used in the episode, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous and People of Colour. It was recorded on the 29th of June 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. Hey, what is your name?
My name is Beverly Little Thunder, and my pronouns are she and her.
Yes, so as I said, usually I start these conversations saying, how do you identify, or tell me about your gender experience. However, this conversation is a little bit different. We are talking about Two-Spirit, and one thing I realized recently is that Two-Spirit is kind of like an umbrella term, I understand, for LGBT. So it includes gender and sexuality and any other things, or is that mainly it?
No, that's mainly it. Two-Spirit encompasses the whole person in the Indigenous community, and it doesn't distinguish between gender and sexuality.
Yeah. See, that's good to know. I like what you said about it encompasses the whole person. I mean, you were involved with not creating the term necessarily, but like the bringing together of the term and how it's been, established, I suppose.
Yes.
So how did that, can you talk a bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, back in 1988, 89, the term had been introduced from some people who came from Canada who had an elder who had said to them, oh, well, then you're two-spirited, when they came out as being, gay or lesbian. And so that's the first time we heard the term. In 1990, we went to a conference for anthropologists in Washington, D.C. And we talked about how anthropologists always referred to Indigenous people in the past tense. There was a lot of writing about trans women from 100 years ago in different tribal communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we said we want to be written about today, who we are today, because we still exist and we had a place in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were challenged and said, okay, if you want us to call you by what your people called you, that you have a name, what do we use as an umbrella term when we're talking about a room full of 50 Indigenous people, all from different tribes? That takes up a lot of print.
Yeah.
So we got together, about 15, 20 of us, also a Indigenous anthropologist, and she sort of helped move the conversation along. And we decided that we did not want to use any one particular tribe's marker. Because up until now, they had been using the term Winkte and Berdache. Winkte is a Lakota word, so that wouldn't apply to someone who was Navajo. And Berdache is a word that stems from a Persian root, meaning boy prostitute or kept boy. And so that kind of eliminated me totally. And so we remembered this term that we had heard, and we talked about it. And in the majority of the tribes that we researched, their belief was that someone who was of a different sexuality or gender possessed the male and female spirit and sort of walked in perfect balance. And so the term two-spirit fit. And so we published a book called Two-Spirit People. And we acknowledged that 25 years from the time the book was written, that the younger generation might have a different term they wanted used, and that not everybody was going to embrace that term. And we understood that, but for now, this is what we would like to be called. And a vast majority of Indigenous people now use the term two-spirit. But as you well know, the younger generation in the last 10 years, they've come up with non-binary, polyamory, all these different terms that I don't even know them all now. But it has been to over 25 years. So we're pretty on target with, saying how far along that would go. And more you're hearing different tribal two-spirit people refer to themselves in their own language, whatever it was their language, called them. And that also went a long way in helping us reclaim what our identities were, what we used 100, 200 years ago. We had a role in our tribes. So, that has helped immensely.
Yeah. Would you speak a bit more about the history of, Two-Spirit even before it was called Two-Spirit, I suppose?
Yeah, well, prior to about 1988, most Indigenous people left the reservation, moved to the cities, and tried to blend in. Tried to blend in as gay or lesbian. On the reservation, most of the time, prior to 1988, you heard, oh, she's like that, or he's like that, without ever really saying gay or lesbian. And so they would move into the cities and searching for other Indigenous people like themselves, they usually wound up in bars. And that was the culture in those days. The drinking, meeting up in bars. A lot of people moved to San Francisco. A lot of people moved to New York City. And the bar culture kind of sucked people in. And by the time I came out in 1986, I'd been out long before then, but when I really, really came out in 1986, I had been a part of our spiritual community. And I was terrified because I lived in California and I went to ceremony in California with Dennis Banks. And I heard the men talk about different individuals who came and wanted to participate in the ceremony who were either openly gay or openly lesbian. And they were shunned. And they were not permitted to be a part of ceremony. And ceremony has always been a huge part of my life, and I was raising my children in this way. So I was terrified that if anybody found out that I was attracted to women, I would be ostracized. And that was my life prior to 1986. I met a gentleman in 1992 who was at the time 73, who had lived for 28 years out in Los Angeles until his partner died. And then he went back to the reservation and lived very quietly and would cook at powwows and events. And everybody knew that he was that way. And his nephew, who identified as gay at the time, invited him to a Two-Spirit gathering. And I will never forget the look on this man's face when he stood up and addressed about 50 Two-Spirit individuals. He cried. He says, I can't believe that for 28 years, I felt totally alone. I felt like something was wrong with me. I felt like nobody would ever embrace who I was. Now I'm standing with all you young people. You have no idea what it does to my heart. And I cried. He cried. Everybody cried. Because that was what we wanted to change. We don't want our young people to have to do that. We want them to grow up on the reservation feeling proud of who they are, to be a part of their communities, to be accepted by their community. And so that, to that end, we began organizing.
Wow,
and today, that was at that time, 1988, 89, that was the only Two-Spirit gathering happening on this continent. Today, there are probably about 30 Two-Spirit groups in Canada and the States that come together and have celebrations every year.
Amazing. That's beautiful. So do you feel that, or do you think that obviously colonialism had a lot to do with the non-acceptance of the Two-Spirit nature in people in your culture?
Well, when we say colonialism, we tend to think of a system of domination, when in actuality, that also encompassed the religious aspect. And they often talk about here in the States about separation of church and state. That is not true. That is not a reality. Church and state are very enmeshed. And missionaries from all denominations flocked to save the souls of these savages, these pagans, as they were identified by, the early settlers. And for a lot of Indigenous people who were taken from their homes, taken from their homelands, forbidden to hunt, fish, to live their lives the way they had for centuries, they had nowhere else to turn but to the church that offered clothing and food in exchange for, you learn our Bible verses and you ascribe to our God because our God loves you. They embraced that. And several generations of that kind of indoctrination, they would cherry pick out of their Bibles verses that said to lie with another woman or to lie with another man was an abomination, and tell their congregants that, if you have someone in your family like that, you must work really hard to get their souls saved or they're going to burn in hell. And so families began to shun those in their families that were like that. And, religion is a huge influence on a people that are trying to survive. And, the very first thing that would happen when a missionary group established a church in or around a reservation was they translated the Bible into their language. because they wanted to make sure that they understood that the Bible was God's word.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it was written, 10 or 15 years after Jesus' death and written by different men. It was
Mm-hmm.
God's word. So
Mm-hmm.
that, that had a lot to do with people not embracing their children and the children being stripped of the role of honor. Families that had children that were differently abled were considered blessed. To have a two-spirit person in your family, you were considered blessed. In old ceremonies, a two-spirit person was often called upon to name babies. And if they chose to name that baby's name was considered very powerful. And it was the two-spirit people who the women fought in some of the battles. They went on hunting excursions. They took care of other women and women's health problems. Oftentimes were midwives and herbalists, and took care of the elderly. And the same for the gay men. They oftentimes adopted children who were orphaned because mom and dad had somehow met an early death. And they took these children and raised these children.
Mm-hmm.
So they were an integral part of that community unit. And all of that dissipated, with the onset of Christianity. And until about 1985, 86, when the AIDS epidemic hit the United States, that remained true. But when more and more indigenous people were infected with HIV, they wanted to go home. They wanted to be with their family. And if their family brought them home, the whole family was generally ostracized. And the family didn't want anyone to know that Sonny here has HIV because nobody knew how it was spread. And they were afraid that they were going to spread it into their community.
Wow. Yeah.
So, that slowly began to change as mothers and fathers stood up and said, no, this is my child and I support my child. But, it was a tenuous journey. And today you have, whole family units that embrace their two-spirit children and grandchildren, relatives.
Yeah.
There are still those pockets of people that are ascribing to that's not God's plan for us. Those are the ones that have embraced Christianity and have been taught that is the way to salvation, whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, there's something you said actually when we first spoke a little while ago. You said tradition set in concrete dies. Tradition has to change with the people. And I was wondering how you feel tradition has evolved when it comes to native LGBTQIA people, especially where gender diversity is concerned, although I appreciate you don't really distinguish between the two, which is an interesting concept, which I also would like to come back to. Yeah.
I think that it has evolved while we don't live in tight-knit communities anymore. A lot of us are out. I see a lot of contemporary peers that are taking their sisters' children and raising them, that are taking care of elderly parents or grandparents, that are doing service to the community. And it may look different now, but it is still has the threads of what their role would have been in community, say 200 years ago. So the tradition has evolved with the times and with what is needed in today's world. I think that along with that, the openness about talking about sexuality, talking about safe sex, talking about homophobia, talking about the suicides of so many of our young people has become almost an everyday conversation in many communities. And in many communities, there are Two-Spirit people who have actually gone to the tribal councils. There are two Lakota women in South Dakota who've gone to the tribal council in Pine Ridge and urged them to adopt an anti-hate bill to allow same-sex marriage on the reservation. And in some communities, they've been successful, and others they've not, but they keep doing it. And they are now living in Rapid City, and they have done a tremendous amount of work to protect the homeless, which in Rapid City is 90% Indigenous people.
Wow.
And there's a lot of white counterparts that will go by the homeless camps and throw beer bottles and rocks and and just to disturb them and to try to harass them. And they have established patrols to protect these homeless people so they can sleep. That's all they're trying to do is sleep down by the river.
Yeah.
So tradition has just kind of moved along with the need.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you feel about, or what does actually masculinity and femininity mean to you? Talking a bit more about the two-spirit as a whole person, and like not necessarily differentiating between gender and sexuality and attraction, I suppose. So yeah, so how does that fit together for you? How do you feel about that?
Well, for me, when I came out, I felt like I was one of those people that was kind of on the fence. I was blessed with children and had married, made 3 men very unhappy, but
Oh.
I also was very drawn to a lot of traditionally male tasks in my life.
Right.
And I used to think that that was because raising 5 children alone, I was forced to. But I look back at it now and I see how I was just living out who I am. My first recollection of that duality came, I believe, in about 1993. And we were gathering wood for a ceremonial fire. And there were 3 women who'd gone with me, all non-Indigenous women. And they were the very butch type, with work boots and tank tops and work gloves. And they were just like, yeah, we're going to go.
Yeah.
And so they had this chainsaw. So I was dragging big branches into a pile because that's what I thought I could do. I didn't, I wasn't going to use a chainsaw because I had 3 butches to do it. I had a huge pile, and these 3 women were standing around this chainsaw looking at it and talking. And I walked over and I says, what's wrong? And they said, well, we can't get the chainsaw to start. And I said, well, let me see. So I took my skirt and I hiked it up. And I kind of held it under my chin so it wouldn't get in the way. Put my foot on the chainsaw, pushed a couple of little buttons, pulled, and the thing started right up.
Nice.
And they all kind of looked at me, and I dropped my skirt and I kind of flipped my hair and said, well, just remember who started the chainsaw butches. And I walked away feeling quite satisfied with myself. But,
Yeah.
I've always been on that line of being able to, I can change a tire. When I went to school, I didn't want to take homemaking in high school. I took auto mechanics so I could learn how to maintenance on my own car.
Yeah.
So for me, that's how it has played out in my life. And I've never really given much thought to it because it's just a part of who I am.
Yeah.
And I've had a native man came here one time to help with things on the land, and spent the whole morning working the splitter and splitting huge piles of wood. And then after lunch, he sat down at the sewing machine in my kitchen and started sewing skirts.
Oh, I love it.
And it was like, yeah, that's what a two-spirit person would do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting about the roles that we take on, I suppose, because I studied electronics for a few years,
Mm-hmm.
which was at the time, there weren't many women doing that. I don't know how
Right.
many there are now, but there weren't many at the time. I didn't continue in that field, but I was like, yeah, why not? This was something I was interested in at the time. So, yeah. And I've changed a few tires as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what message would you give to young people today?
I think the message that I would give to young people today is you are not alone. Be proud of who you are, and you don't want to be a carbon copy of everything you see in society. You're an individual, and
Mhm.
that's your gift. That's your gift to the world that you live in. Be
Mhm.
very boring if we were all the same. And I also would remind them that the 7 generations that have gone before you have worked hard to allow you to stand where you stand today. It's now your job to create the world for the next 7 generations coming after you.
Mm.
And don't ever forget that. Because if you remember what went before you and what's coming after you, it's real clear what you need to do right now. I am so proud of the young people of today. And I've heard people say, oh, well, they dress so strange and they dye their hair strange colors and they wear these big, um, oh, gauges in their ears.
Mm.
All of that is so superficial compared to what is inside of them and the things
Mhm.
that they hold dear to their heart and the things that they want to see for the future.
Mhm.
And they need to be encouraged. I don't want them to be like me. I don't want them to be a carbon copy of who I am, to
Mhm.
even express their spirituality in the ways that I do. I want them to hear their own voices inside themselves and have the courage to follow those, even when the mainstream says that's crazy.
Mhm.
You know, when
Yeah.
someone tells me now, Beverly, that's kind of crazy, I'm like, oh well.
Must be doing something right then.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. That's what I'd want young people to hear and to
Mhm.
to know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. That's really powerful, I think, if you think back, but also in the future, like generations in the future. I mean, I don't have children myself, but I do feel like a sense of not responsibility, but maybe responsibility. I'm conscious, like environmentally conscious and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's good to think ahead as well as respect what's behind you.
Well, you don't have to give birth to be a role model,
Totally.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
you can be a parent, but we are all parents to every child that passes through our lives.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Every child is watching us. You
Mm.
may not know that. You may not be aware of it, but they are watching us
Yeah.
and they will emulate us. And at the end of the day, do I want that child to emulate what I've done that is positive? Or do I want them to emulate what I've done that I really am not very proud of?
Mm. Yeah. Just let that sink in, really. Um, yeah. So I just finished last month, I think, I finished listening to your audiobook, which is called One Bead at a Time. What made you decide to share your story? Were you asked to, or was it something that you wanted to do yourself?
I had wanted to do it for a number of years. For a long, long time, there were no books out there about Two-Spirit people. And I felt, and I still feel, that we all need to write our stories. Those stories need to be out there, and we cannot depend upon the world at large to write about us. We need to write about ourselves. And I had started writing, and my friend Sharon from Canada was coming to ceremony, and I mentioned to her, and she was a writer, and she said, "We're going to get that book done. We are going to do it." And so we recorded about 20 hours of my talking, and she edited it all. And she called me and said, "Beverly," she said, "after I edited it," she said, "there was not much that I had to change." She said, "It sounded like you talking." She said, "It's the way that you would have said something." And so she helped me put it together and find a publisher and get it published. Sadly, about 6 months after the book was released, she died of cancer of the liver. But that I will be forever grateful for her for pushing me, because now I'm about halfway through writing follow-up. And I think that it's important because it shares a journey of how I got to where I am. And it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Yeah.
And I wanted people to realize that, they weren't alone. I have had so many people come to me and say, "Oh, that resonated with me. Oh, that happened to me too. I felt that way."
Yeah.
Some say in 1 minute I was laughing hysterically and the next minute I was crying. And that said a lot to me. That said that it did sound like my voice, and I wanted it to be my voice.
Yeah.
So that, that's what kind of inspired that. And as I said, I'll be forever grateful to Sharon for encouraging me and helping me to know that, I had the capability of writing, because I didn't see myself as a writer. I'm not the kind of person that keeps a journal every day, but maybe once a month and once every other month, I'll sit down and I'll write a few pages about what's going on. And I must have at least half a dozen journals that have a few pages in each one.
Yeah. But the thing is, you can do it your way. So for you, the speaking it was
the way
more suitable for you, and that was more comfortable for you.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, from what you're saying, your friend Sharon is, her spirit is part of the book and part of this project, very much so, right? Yeah. Amazing. So I said I listened to the audiobook. So did you decide not to narrate it yourself? So you obviously got someone to do that, or the publisher did get someone?
The publisher did that.
Yeah.
The publisher did that. And I actually interviewed a couple of people until I decided on the person who wound up narrating it.
Yeah. What made you resonate with her in particular?
She sounded like me.
Yeah.
Not that I've listened to myself a lot.
Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. So tell me about your follow-up book. When is that due to be out?
My follow-up book is mainly focusing on when I was asked to leave the ceremony in South Dakota and the journey that I went upon in developing the women's Sundance ceremony that I have been doing for the last 40 years. And it encompasses all the positives and the negatives that happened, the pains and the joys of that, and everything in between, because it wasn't something that just sort of happened organically. It was a lot of work and meeting a lot of people that had their own agendas, and felt that, oh, if I participate in the ceremony, it's going to make me a medicine woman. And that's not what our ceremony is about. It's about praying for the people and for the earth. And there is no one leader. My job as the founder, I guess you would call it, of the ceremony, was to identify and train someone younger to take over. And that wound up being my daughter. And now my daughter is looking around her to see, okay, who's going to fill this spot? Because someday I'm going to have to step back, because that's what I have to do. And it's been, we are now in Vermont, and we have a piece of land that will be put in trust to always be held for women's ceremony after my partner and I pass. And it's important that whoever takes over that understands that this is not about ownership. This is not about titles. This is not about getting rich. It's a labor of love. And that, that is what I hope will be my, my legacy. That's what I've worked really hard to instill.
Yeah.
People that have come through.
Beautiful. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
I think the one thing that we haven't talked about is the racial disparities in the Lgbt community.
Right.
As an Indigenous woman, I often find myself in groups of non-Indigenous people, and even some BIPOC people, being set aside as the Indigenous person.
Right.
I am outspoken. I'm very confident about who I am, and I understand that sort of, draws people to me. But then oftentimes I don't feel I'm really listened to.
Right.
They only hear what they want to hear. And, like right now, the climate and environment is a huge, huge issue on this planet. And I'm often called upon to do what they call a land acknowledgement, which is something they've been doing in the last few years, to acknowledge the people that once lived on the land where I live. And that's well and good, but I've taken to saying, okay, let's remember that we are on unceded land that the Abenaki lived on, but let's not let it go at that. Let us look at what their needs are. Let us go to them and say, what do you need in your communities? You have a food bank that you need to have replenished? Do your people need school clothes for their children? What do they need? Let's find out what the community needs to thrive, and do it in form of reparations. And it's really, really difficult. Most recently here in the States, they've recognized Juneteenth, June 16th,
right,
as the celebration for when slavery finally technically ended in that form.
Right.
Because it still continues today. But every news station I watched, every paper I saw, was this big thing about how they were everywhere. They're making a big celebration of this. And I couldn't help but think, while I was happy for them, for that community, that to have that recognition, When is that recognition going to be given by our government to the indigenous people of this country? When are they going to acknowledge the harm that they have inflicted? When are they going to start talking about reparations for indigenous people? When are they going to start talking about all of the trees they have not honored? You know, even in Canada, they're starting to unearth all of these graves at residential schools of children.
Wow.
When is the United States going to go to the schools here in the United States and start owning what took place there?
Yeah.
That, you know, that's something that weighs heavily on my mind. And, you know, for some, not all, but for some, you know, Black friends, they see that as betrayal. They see that as, oh, you're anti-Black. No, I'm not anti-Black. I just want to see justice done for the people who had genocide committed against us. That's what it was.
Yeah.
You can go through all of the political speeches of presidents and governmental people at that time. They all talked about ridding this country of indigenous people.
Wow.
You know, so you know that's always heavy in my heart, even as I move forward and want to see change in the future. That's a past from my ancestors, and they're constantly there saying, "Don't forget us, don't forget us."
Yeah.
And I can't do that. I can't forget them. So racism, you know, is a big issue here in this country, and I see more and more of the non-people of color in this country starting to look at their own privilege and starting to look at, you know, their own contributions to racism and recognizing that they were born into racism and owning it and striving to change it. So that gives me hope. That gives me hope that, you know, the paradigm will change because to save the earth, all of us are going to need to be hand in hand. We can't allow, you know, this wedge that the government created, because it was a planned, created domination system that at the beginning of this country. We need to tear that wall down and hold each other's hands and move forward.
Beautiful. I love that. That's a vision I'll hold as well.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with me.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Beverly, which is Beverly, where you can also read the transcript. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded. Wow. Yeah. Whew.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed taking the time
Me too.
with you.